Hi theory students. Today we're going to be learning about second species in our counterpoint exercises. We'll be talking about the rhythmic features, what's different from second species compared to first species, how to use this new device called a passing tone, how to do our endings, the right way to use perfect consonances, and strategies for how to write these lines. First, the rhythmic feature. Each measure of the counterpoint will now have two half notes for each note of the cantus. So, for example, if we start our line this way, we can now have two half notes here, two half notes here, etc. for the rest of the line. There are exceptions. The last measure is going to be a whole note, and it will be on the tonic. So in this example, if we're at the very end of the line and we have the cantus going from re to do, then we're going to have do in the last measure as a whole note, not two half notes. Another exception, which we'll learn about later, is that in the next to last measure, I have to go T-do. I can either do that this way with two half notes, or under certain circumstances, I may only be able to have a single whole note on T. But one way or another, the note right before do at the end is going to be T, whether it's the second of two half notes or a whole note that takes up the entire measure. So the measure is now divided into a downbeat and an upbeat. The downbeat is the first half note of the measure, and it gets more stress or emphasis. The upbeat will be the second note of the measure, and that gets less stress or emphasis, and this gives us a little more freedom. Here's what I mean by more freedom, and I'll show you how to use passing tones. The downbeats, just like in first species, must all be consonant. So that will be thirds and sixths, those are the imperfect ones. Unisons in places, beginning and end, fifths, octaves, those are the perfect consonances. The upbeats may be consonant, those intervals I just showed you, or under certain conditions they may even be dissonant. And if you remember, those were seconds, fourths, sevenths, ninths, or augmented or diminished intervals. If we move into the upbeat by step and continue by step in the same direction, the upbeat may be dissonant. We call that a passing tone. Let me show you an example. So let's say we have two measures of a cantus. We have an E and we have an F. And suppose we are starting the measure on an octave. If I want to, I can go down by step. That's a dissonance, a seventh. But if I can resolve it to a consonance, then I can use this, the passing tone. Notice the features. I'm going into it by step. I'm continuing by step in the same direction. And both downbeats here and here are consonances. Whether they're perfect or imperfect consonances, this can work either way. It's good to use passing tones. They make the line smoother, and they're one of the features of second species. Now, about the startings and endings. Just as before, we have to start with a perfect consonance, but now we have an option to start with either two half notes or a rest and a half note. So let's go back to the beginning of a line, and let's imagine that we're starting the cantus with a C and then going to a D in the key of C major. I can start with two half notes, and then go to something on the next downbeat. That's one of my options. Notice this upbeat has to be consonant because I'm skipping to it. I can't use a dissonance here. I'm not moving into this by step. Okay, or another one of my options would be to do something like this. Now I'm using two half notes, but I've got a passing tone on the upbeat over here. I could also do this. Start with a half rest and a half note perfect consonance. And then go right across the bar line to another consonant. So those are my options here for beginnings. Now let's talk about endings. As I showed you before, the last measure will be a whole note, and it'll be on the tonic. And the next to last measure will either be two half notes with the upbeat as leading tone, or a whole note leading tone only. So just as I showed you before, if the line is ending re do in the cantus, I'm going to be on do for a whole note, not two half notes. And then either I'll have two half notes, something like that perhaps. Note that the note right before the tonic is the leading tone. Here it's on an upbeat. If for some reason I can't use two half notes going to the leading tone, then I have to put the leading tone on the downbeat, and it's going to be a whole note, not two half notes. We'll learn about situations where either one would be correct. Perfect consonances. We know from first species that we have to be careful how we approach them. So let me show you the different ways of doing it. A perfect consonance on an upbeat will work because we approach that by oblique motion. So for example, if I have a D and an F. Here's a sixth. Here's a fifth. This fifth is on the upbeat. And we're going to that fifth while the D is sustaining. So we consider that oblique motion. That's fine. Here's what we avoid. We avoid having the same perfect consonants on consecutive downbeats. So going back to this example, we want to avoid this, where we've got a fifth, and then another fifth from downbeat to downbeat. If I had a different perfect consonance, for example, if I went from an octave to a fifth over here, that might be allowed. The other thing we need to avoid is moving across the bar line to a perfect consonance in similar motion. We're familiar with that from first species. So the example I just showed you, actually, similar motion from the B to the C and from the D to the F. So we would have to rework that. On the other hand, if I did something like this, and reversed those, now I'm going down to the C and up to the F, and that would be perfectly all right. So that's how we treat perfect consonances. So here are our strategies. You'll have many more skips and leaps within measures because either you'll be using a passing tone which moves by step, or you'll be moving from one consonant to another, and most consonances are skips or leaps apart from each other. Therefore, in order to balance that, when you're moving across the bar line, you try to move by step. Look for places to use passing tones. That will make things more conjunct or stepwise. These second species lines will be more jagged and contain more leaps than first species. Try to control this to make the lines more fluid. Let me go through an entire line and I'll show you how it works. So I've got half of the line here. I can't fit this all on one page. And then on to the next. The cantus sounds like this. So in this particular case, if I'm going to be starting this on a C up here, I am trying to look ahead to see where I want to be on this next downbeat. It's a good idea to think from downbeat to downbeat and then let the upbeat fill in the gap in between. So it would be a good place to be on a third there. So that tells me I have an opportunity to use a passing tone. I'm looking at a sixth on that downbeat, and that gives me an opportunity for another passing tone. If I wanted to mix things up and use a fifth on this downbeat, notice that a sixth here and a fifth there, so that part's okay. But I have to put in an upbeat that's not going to move to this fifth in similar motion. So that's why I'm not going to use a D passing tone here. But instead, we'll have a leap up to an F. So now I'm approaching this fifth with this going down and that going up. It might be nice to be on a third over here. So I can't use the D on the previous upbeat. If I tried to use a D, that would be a fourth, and since I would be skipping from that D to the B, that's not a passing tone and can't be used. So over here, I'm going to use 2/3 in a row. There's nothing wrong with that. Just looking ahead, I'm going to an E in the next measure. So now, I might do something like this and use a passing tone, which will take me to a third over there. And that might be good, but I can't use a passing tone here. So I'll use another consonance in that measure. I'm starting to think about how I'm going to get to my ending. And in this particular case, I can have a fifth here and have two notes in that measure, only if I get to that A in contrary motion. So in order to get this to work, I'll leap down to the G and then come back in the other direction. So here's what that whole line sounds like. And moving. Together with both lines, here's the next part. Those are the basics. We'll do a lot of examples in class. That's all for today.